All right, Google, play my Pixel 7 Pro review. This is the Pixel 7 Pro, and as someone who really enjoyed both the Pixel 6 and 6 Pro last year, it is probably an understatement to say that I was super excited for this year's release from Google. And as always, I really wanted to let the dust settle with this device before providing my thoughts on it. I wanted to let the first and even second wave of reviews come through, hold off for a software update or two, and more than anything, I really wanted to let this device learn my usage habits so that I could get the most out of it. And so after using this phone as my main and everyday device for a full month, I'm finally ready to share some thoughts on it. You ready? Let's dive in. Now, it's worth pointing out right at the top here that this phone is very similar to the 6 Pro from last year. As you've already no doubt heard in a lot of reviews on this phone so far, it really is an iterative update rather than a huge and ambitious redesign. And you know what? That is a good thing. Last year's devices were a huge departure from anything Google had released before them, what with huge redesigns and brand new in-house chipsets powering the devices. And so just like any new product release, unless you're a huge tech enthusiast, it's actually always a much safer bet waiting for version 2 to be released and then jumping on that. And so with that being said, let's discuss the differences between this phone and last year's phone. We'll start with the design, and for me, there are really three main areas that have been changed with the 7 Pro. The first change, which is perhaps my favorite refinement over last year's device, is that the display is now ever so slightly less curved on the edges. And it might seem like a subtle difference, but for me, this has made the phone much more comfortable to hold and use. The second change is that both the power button and the volume rockers are now slightly lower on the side of the device. Google has done this to make the phone slightly more one-handed friendly, which I think a lot of users will appreciate, but something to keep in mind is that they're actually now so low that they interfere with some car phone holders. And if you have a holder like mine, you'll find that the volume rocker will be constantly pressed whenever it's in position. But then the last big design refresh with the 7 Pro here is the camera housing on the back. Instead of black glass like what we had on last year's entire lineup of devices, we now have a shiny single piece of metal that fully blends in with the side rails. And when I first saw the renders of this redesign, I thought, what on earth are Google doing here? This looks awful. But in reality, I actually prefer this redesign and quite enjoy the dual cutout look here on the back. That said, it does scratch way more than the previous glass camera unit, so that's obviously not a great thing. Only three things I'd like Google to change about this design for next year's lineup. Firstly, to offer a matte or frosted back version rather than the glossy version we have for every color in this lineup. Plus, I'd love matte rails on the side of the phone as well, like the regular Pixel 7, and I'd love it if the bezels on the front of the phone could be completely symmetrical. But speaking of that display, pretty much everything about the 7 Pro's display is the same as last year's 6 Pro, except for the peak brightness, which has received a much needed bump up to 1500 nits as opposed to the 860 nits of max brightness from last year's 6 Pro. Pixel phones have always had some of the dimmest displays on the market, so this bump has been very much appreciated, and you seriously do notice how much brighter the phone is in bright conditions. Important to note though, this peak brightness only comes into play in what is essentially direct sunlight, and you need to have adaptive brightness switched on. If you just use the brightness slider to crank the display manually, then it'll actually be capped to a max brightness of 1000 nits. There is one downside to this incredibly bright display though, which is battery life. Now, for all intents and purposes, the battery life of this phone is actually really solid, and most days I've used it, particularly if it's been a fairly light to medium day of use, the phone will be sitting with anywhere between 30 to 40% of battery life left at the end of the day, except for days where I've spent a prolonged amount of time outdoors and in bright sunlight. In those scenarios, you can literally watch your battery percentage plummet, and the device will also get quite warm to the touch, more so than any other device I've used with similar levels of display brightness. Now, I'm only mentioning this to make you aware of it, and in actuality, I'm not really complaining about it. Sure, I'd love it if Google could fix this, but for far too long, we've asked and asked Google over and over to increase their display brightness. And of course, we knew that this would come with a hit to battery life as a result. And they've held off right up until now, but you know what? I'm just glad they've added it. And you can always just set your phone to manual brightness if you don't want to risk the drain to your battery. Just two other quick comments on build quality, the first of which being the haptics. Now, last year I said that Google had reclaimed their throne at the top of the Android pile in terms of haptics, but since that video, I would actually say that Samsung leapt ahead in terms of haptics with their entire S22 lineup of phones. Well, with the 7 Pro, Google has taken the crown back once again. And I've got to say, the haptics on this phone are the absolute best you'll find on any phone right now. Yes, even better than the iPhones. They're phenomenal. And then we have this fingerprint sensor, and this really was one of the weakest areas of the Pixel 6 lineup of phones, even after a full year's worth of software updates. But thankfully, Google have improved the sensor in this phone quite a bit, probably thanks in part to an improved sensor, as well as some software trickery. However, the biggest contributor that makes it feel like a much faster sensor is the new Face Unlock feature. Now, granted, this is not the amazing Face Unlock implementation we had on the Pixel 4 lineup. It is just camera-based, so it will not work in the dark, but in good conditions, it works really, really well. And the best part about it is how it's been implemented from the software side of things. Now, to take a quick step back, with pretty much every device that has this sort of camera-based Face Unlock biometric method in conjunction with an in-display fingerprint sensor, given that the Face Unlock is often not super reliable, you do still get into the habit of always pressing the fingerprint sensor to unlock your phone. But with Face Unlock enabled on pretty much every other device with this feature, as soon as your face is successfully registered, the fingerprint sensor icon disappears, and you're often left wondering why on earth your phone isn't unlocking. But with the Pixel 7's Face Unlock implementation, even if your face is successfully registered, the fingerprint sensor doesn't disappear, but instead becomes a button to unlock your phone with. And the end result is just a really, really seamless experience that, put simply, just makes the fingerprint sensor itself feel way, way faster than last year's Pixel 6 and 6 Pro. Now, before we chat about the software on this phone alongside how it performs, if you've just bought yourself a brand new Pixel 7 or 7 Pro and you're wanting to keep it in mint condition, or you're just wanting to breathe some life into an older device, then I can highly recommend picking up a case from channel sponsor RhinoShield. I've spoken about RhinoShield several times on the channel now, and that's because their cases are, to put it simply, some of the best you'll find on the market. And they've just gotten even better thanks to some really nifty upgrades. So they're now easier to take off and put back on. They're also more grippy and easier to clean. And then perhaps my favorite part is that they're also now even more customizable. Along with customizing the colors, you can also switch up the buttons. You can choose from stacks of designs from Beckman to PewDiePie. And when you pair this with RhinoShield's new grip, which is available in both adhesive and MagSafe variants, not only do you get an extra layer of comfort whenever you're holding your phone, but you also get yourself a really solid kickstand as well. On top of that, right now, during their Black Friday sales, RhinoShield is offering anyone who uses the code SAMBF at checkout an additional 10% on top of the up to 60% discounts they're already offering. Pretty dang cool. All right, from there, let's chat about the software on this phone, and perhaps more importantly, the performance. And again, this was perhaps one of the bigger downsides to last year's lineup of phones, in that whilst the software experience itself was nice, it was also very buggy. And again, I kind of attribute all of those issues to the release of Android 12, which, much like the Pixel 6 lineup itself, was a huge redesign compared to previous iterations of Android. And when you pair that with a brand new, largely untested chipset, it's not surprising that the end result was a little buggy. But I'm very glad to report that things have been much more smooth and reliable this time around. And I think this is thanks to the release of Android 13, which, similar to the Pixel 7 lineup, was a much more iterative software update compared to Android 12. It's still really fluid thanks to all of those system-wide animations, most of which remain unchanged compared to Android 12, and I haven't really experienced any of those concerning bugs in the month that I've been using this phone. There is this one weird new change though, which is when you're sending an app into the recents panel like this, where there's this weird fade that occurs before it sort of lands itself into the carousel. And this is the same on every Pixel phone I've tried running Android 13, and I honestly think it looks pretty sloppy. Google, what is this? Aside from that though, one really nice benefit to Android 13 on the Pixel 7 Pro here has been how well it has worked in conjunction with the latest beta release of Nova Launcher and with gesture navigation enabled. Up until now, using a third-party launcher with gestures was really janky, to the point where I honestly couldn't do it. But with the latest version of Nova Launcher, just take a look at these amazing animations. This is a third-party launcher, and somehow Nova Launcher has pulled off some absolute wizardry to make the experience not awful. Now, it's still not quite as smooth as the stock launcher itself, which honestly just feels like absolute butter, but I've been using Nova Launcher for the entire month of using this phone and have really enjoyed it. And I actually think that this means that the world of third-party launchers may just be about to have a comeback, and I am all for it. Aside from customization though, if you just want an outrageously fluid and downright useful software experience with all of those fantastic software tricks thrown in, like voice message transcripts or photo unblurring, which can yield some really impressive results, then there's really no better option than the Pixel software experience. And so finally, we have the cameras. And despite things seeming to be relatively similar to last year's Pixel 6 Pro, the entire camera experience has actually received a number of improvements that I think make it one of the most versatile camera arrays on the market. Now, the main lens is the exact same 50 megapixel f1.9 lens that last year's 6 Pro had, which captures, for mine, the absolute best images in any conditions compared to any smartphone on the market. But Google have now followed Apple's lead by adding a 2x shooting mode, which basically crops into that 50 megapixel sensor, allowing you to capture photos with a 2x field of view without any discernible loss in image quality. So potentially thanks to that change, Google then decided to ditch the 4x telephoto lens from last year's 6 Pro and instead went with a 5x lens. But then they've one-upped Apple by also using that sensor cropping trickery to allow for images to be taken at a 10x field of view that honestly look nearly as good as the results coming from Samsung phones that have a dedicated 10x lens. Add on to that they've changed the ultra-wide lens to a much wider 126-degree lens with autofocus, therefore unlocking a new macro shooting mode, which is very much appreciated, plus an improved selfie camera, as well as all of the software trickery you get thanks to Google's incredible image processing. And like I said, you end up with one of the most versatile set of cameras on any smartphone today. Oh, and every lens also now allows 4K shooting at up to 60 frames a second, which is fantastic. One small complaint I've got with the cameras on this phone though is in regards to autofocus, particularly when using that telephoto lens. When you're that far zoomed in optically, the depth of field is naturally going to be quite shallow, which as a side note can look seriously phenomenal, but I've actually really struggled with the autofocus system, just completely missing the mark on a lot of occasions. So hopefully this is something that Google can improve with software updates down the line. With that being said, I have also noticed some improvements in how fast the camera snaps are shot thanks to that upgraded Tensor G2 chipset inside. Plus, I've got to say, video quality captured on this phone is getting really good. Right up there with Samsung's top-end flagships, and in some cases, it can even capture shots that look better than the results you get from the latest iPhones. However, it's also definitely not quite as consistent or reliable. So you get some amazing videos and also some subpar videos. We also now have a brand new cinematic blur mode for video shooting, which is similar in concept to Apple's own cinematic mode, but unfortunately it's not nearly as reliable or as well implemented, even compared to Apple's first attempt with the iPhone 13 Pro lineup last year. It's not that it's capped to HD, which was also the case with the iPhone 13 Pro's version, but it's that the autofocus is just super unreliable, and there's no way to adjust the depth of field either before you shoot or after you shoot like you can with Apple's version. The video quality itself is nearly as good as Apple's version though, but the edge detection kind of leaves a little to be desired. I honestly hope that Google can quickly improve the implementation of this feature, because whilst it was a nice feature to have on last year's iPhone 13 Pro, but one that I didn't really use on the Pixel 7 Pro, it's one that I would actually recommend avoiding altogether in its current state. Just one other improvement I'd like Google to work on though in regards to the camera experience is the speed at which the lenses change over. For example, whenever you're shooting with the main lens and you tap that 5x button to zoom in, there's always a solid second or so before the lens actually switches. And if you're trying to snap a quick shot, then it can actually result in either a low quality digitally zoomed in shot or just missing the shot altogether thanks to how long it took for the lens to switch over. And it's particularly disorientating when shooting video. So I'd love to see this improve to where the lens changes nearly as soon as you tap that 5x button, because that would make what is already a pretty great camera experience quite a bit more reliable. And so after using this phone for a full month, I have to say, this just might be the phone of the year for me. Now I am yet to review the regular Pixel 7, so perhaps that sentiment will change once I have, but for my money, I think the improved cameras and the slightly brighter display just about justify spending the extra money, particularly if you're looking for the best that Android has to offer. If you want to see my review of the regular Pixel 7 when that goes live, then make sure that you're subscribed to the channel, and don't forget to check out the incredible RhinoShield cases using the first link down in the description, and use the code SAMBF at checkout for an additional 10% off their already impressive Black Friday discounts. But aside from that, hopefully you enjoyed the video. Thank you all very much for watching, and I will catch you later.